When a stranger's email cracks open the case that stole his children and his good name, a quiet father steps back into the arena as truth surfaces. Slow, stubborn, undeniable. He must outlast a system of family's doubt and his own fear to reclaim the life he built. I used to mark the passing of time with small household sounds like the thud of a backpack near the entry bench and the soft rattle of a lunchbox zipper being wrestled open and the whisper of sneakers sliding across hardwood after a park run, and those were the kinds of moments that made my chest feel full in the way a person means when they say they are lucky in quiet ways that do not need applause because the applause is built into ordinary life if you know where to listen. Then the sounds changed and the house learned a new rhythm made of legal pads and email alerts and the slow drip of sleepless nights where everything hums at once except the part of your brain that used to trust the world to be fair, because that part goes silent when accusations land like hail and you realize that even small dents can total a life if there are enough of them. Before the storm I thought my marriage was bent but not broken because every long road has potholes and we were two tired people dodging them as best we could while still getting the kids to school and keeping the fridge honest and waving at familiar neighbors who had lawn opinions and friendly dogs and the kind of easy small talk that makes a block feel like a blanket. I did not see the pivot point until it spun me, and by the time lawyers were teaching me new definitions for old words I was a student who could no longer choose his own lessons and the test questions felt like riddles written by someone who disliked me. The claims arrived in tidy paragraphs that made me sound like a stranger and my phone went heavy in my hand as if it knew it had become a museum of every text and calendar alert that might be repurposed into evidence against a person who had not learned how to fear ordinary messages. I believed my family would shore me up because that is what families say they are for when life goes sideways and the wind wants to push you into the ditch. I found instead that people sometimes hope to outrun a gust by pointing at someone else and saying, "Look over there," and I was there, and it was me, and the pointing was dressed in careful concern that sounded official under fluorescent lights. I watched relatives I grew up with explain my character as if it were a house inspection, and they had discovered a rotten beam that no one had ever noticed, and I sat very still while my lawyer squeezed a pen hard enough to leave a crescent on his palm, and I made a small promise to myself that I would not let this turn me into a monument to bitterness no matter how easy that sculpture might be to carve. Court feels like a theater where the stage lights burn so hot that memory wilts, and even a clean shirt feels like armor that forgot how to protect anyone, and I learned that the truth is not a sprinter who wins on speed but a distance runner who needs water stops and faith and shoes that do not blister. The orders came down and they were written in the calm voice of official ink, and suddenly I became the kind of father who packs a bag for weekends and who learns the geography of supervised rooms with polite posters about sharing while pretending not to notice the clock because measuring time is cruel when it belongs to someone else. The payments began and my budget turned into a puzzle with missing pieces, and I took extra shifts and sold old hobby gear and told myself that endurance is a muscle that grows under load if you remember to breathe. There were mornings when I woke before the alarm because the house keeps leftover echoes, and sometimes I could still hear my kids arguing about the good cereal, and then I would make coffee in the quiet and think about the gap between who I knew myself to be and who the paper said I was, and I would try to bridge it with steady routines like iron shirts and clean dishes because ordinary order can be a life raft when the river bucks. Friends rotated around me in cautious circles since no one wants to choose sides in a storm that might drift, and I took no offense because fear of getting wet is human and I was already soaked. I kept a list of small goals like new sheets and a finished book and a jog that did not end in a knot, and each check mark felt like a sandbag on the levee. What I could not shake was the sense that the story had seams that showed in the right light, the way a counterfeit bill reveals its blank spaces when you hold it up to the sun. There were dates that did not line up and statements that contradicted earlier statements and digital footprints that wandered where the narrative insisted no one had walked, and the sum of these did not yet add up to rescue, but they kept me from surrender. I began saving screenshots like a squirrel hides acorns, and I organized them into folders with plain names because plain keeps a person from hoping too loudly, and I found that careful attention is its own kind of prayer. Then one evening after a day shaped by spreadsheets and leftover pasta and a laundry cycle that refused to finish, I opened my email and saw a name I had never seen and a subject line that mentioned my ex and the word truth in a tone that did not try to shout, and whatever air still lived in my lungs forgot its job for a second while the cursor hovered and the house waited as if it knew a new sound was about to enter and change the rhythm again. The email came from an address I did not recognize, and the subject line read like the first sentence of a story I was not sure I wanted to read because it promised an ending that could rearrange the rest of my days. For a long time I just stared at it while the hum of the refrigerator filled the room with a sound that felt like the universe holding its breath. When I finally opened it, the words were simple and without drama. A man wrote that he was dating my ex-wife and that he had discovered something during their relationship that I needed to know. He said he could prove that several of her accusations were fabricated and he had evidence to back every claim. I read that paragraph so many times it started to lose shape like an overplayed song until I forced myself to stand up and pour a glass of water just to remember how to move my hands. The message included a brief outline of what he had found. There were screenshots of old conversations between him and her where she bragged about making me look like the villain. There were emails between her and her lawyer where she had discussed how to phrase certain claims so they would seem believable. He mentioned recordings that he had taken when she started venting about how easy it had been to turn my own family against me because she knew exactly which buttons to push and which stories to feed them. Reading his words felt like being handed the script of a play I had been forced to act in without ever seeing the lines. I sat for a long time after that, letting the weight of it settle. I thought about my parents and my sister and how they had looked at me in court like strangers who were still deciding whether to trust their own memories. I thought about the way my father had shaken his head when the verdict came down and how I had almost reached out to him but stopped because something in his expression said the damage was deeper than words could mend. If what this man claimed was true, then all those broken ties had been cut by a lie, and that realization made my chest feel both light and heavy at the same time. Before responding, I printed the email and every attached file. I spread them across my kitchen table under the glare of a single bulb and studied each one as though understanding the order of the evidence could somehow help me rebuild time. Every piece fit with an ache that felt too precise to be random. There were timestamps that matched court dates. There were draft documents that mirrored the exact wording of the sworn statements used against me. There was even a message where she bragged that she could spin any story if it meant keeping the kids because everyone would assume a mother was telling the truth. I had to sit down when I reached that part because the air felt thinner than before. I wrote the man back that same night, keeping my tone measured because experience had taught me that emotion is the enemy of clarity. I thanked him for reaching out and asked why he was doing this now. His reply came quickly. He said he could no longer live with the guilt of knowing what she had done. He described her as manipulative and controlling and said he had ended things after discovering the extent of her deceit. He claimed he had already contacted an attorney of his own to confirm the legal process for submitting evidence that could reverse false testimony. I did not know whether to believe him entirely yet, but something in the calm tone of his writing and the level of detail told me this was real. Sleep was impossible that night. My body stayed restless even though exhaustion pressed on my eyes like sand. I kept pacing from room to room, touching the walls as if they might offer an answer. For years I had carried the belief that I was somehow at fault for everything that happened. That belief had become the spine of my days, guiding how I spoke and how I moved. I had learned to apologize for existing too loudly and to keep my head down when people whispered. Now there was a chance that I was not the monster everyone had been told to see, and that possibility frightened me almost as much as it thrilled me because it meant that the ground might shift again. The next morning I called my lawyer. His voice carried the same weary tone I had grown used to over the months since the trial, but when I told him about the email he grew quiet. I could hear paper rustling as he took notes. He asked me to forward everything immediately and promised to verify the authenticity. Later that afternoon he called back sounding more alert than I had heard him in a long time. He said the evidence appeared legitimate and that we might have grounds to reopen the case. He warned that the process would be long and messy, but the foundation looked strong. Hearing that made me realize I had forgotten what hope feels like when it stands upright instead of crawling. In the days that followed, my routine changed. I began visiting his office regularly and we organized the material into folders thicker than old phone books. Each meeting brought new layers of disbelief and quiet fury as more inconsistencies surfaced. Meanwhile, I tried to reach out to my family again, but most of them did not respond. The few who did sent short, uncertain messages that hinted at shame without naming it. I did not push because patience was now my only real skill. I knew that if the truth truly emerged, it would speak louder than any argument I could make. One evening after a long meeting with my lawyer, I walked by a playground near my apartment, where a group of kids were chasing a soccer ball across a patch of grass that glowed gold in the sinking sun. Their laughter drifted toward me, and for the first time in years, it did not hurt to listen. It reminded me of something I used to believe before everything went wrong, that life has a way of looping back to fairness if you give it enough road. I went home that night and slept a full 8 hours for the first time since the day my world cracked open. When I woke, I saw another message from the same man waiting in my inbox. The subject line was short and quiet again. It simply said, "There is more." The words "there is more" carried a weight that no digital font could soften, and for a long time I just watched the screen glow as if staring could slow the movement of whatever was coming next. When I finally opened the message, the contents were brief but heavy enough to tilt my morning into silence. He had attached a folder full of recordings and screenshots that went beyond the first set he had sent earlier. These were not just casual conversations or private rants. They were files that detailed exactly how my ex-wife had built the accusations from scratch and coached certain people on what to say. Among them was something that made my pulse stutter, an audio clip of her talking to my sister in a coffee shop. I knew that voice anywhere. My ex was explaining how easy it would be to get my family to take her side if she made herself look frightened and fragile. She told my sister to testify that I had a temper even if she had never actually seen me lose it. I listened to that recording at least 10 times, each time pressing the phone harder to my ear, as if repetition could make disbelief dissolve into certainty. There was no mistaking it. Every word was clear and measured. The sound of clinking cups and background chatter made it impossible to claim editing. My lawyer confirmed the timestamp matched a day 2 months before the hearing, when my sister had gone mysteriously silent on me. I remembered calling her that evening and getting only a short text back that said she was busy but loved me. Now I could see the truth layered beneath those polite words, and it burned like cold metal against the skin. Once we had everything cataloged, my lawyer arranged a meeting with a private investigator who specialized in post-judgment reviews. The man was older, with the kind of calm that comes from seeing every brand of human mess and surviving it. He listened to the recordings without comment, and at the end, he nodded slowly, saying he had enough to begin tracing the digital trail to confirm authenticity. When I asked him how long it would take, he said, "As long as honesty takes to crawl through mud, but that it always crawls forward eventually." That strange reassurance stayed with me long after I left his office. I began to imagine what it might mean to stand in front of a judge again, not as a defendant trying to prove I was not what they said I was, but as a man asking for the return of truth itself. That thought made me nervous because the idea of being vindicated felt almost too bright to look at directly. I had spent so long adjusting my eyes to dim light that sunlight now looked suspicious. I tried not to hope too loudly, but hope is a creature that slips through cracks no matter how carefully you seal them. My lawyer filed a motion to reopen the case based on newly discovered evidence. The paperwork was a mountain of pages covered in the precise language of law, but underneath the dry sentences beat a small heart that said maybe this can be undone. When the notice came that the court had agreed to a review, I stood in the middle of my apartment and realized my hands were shaking. I did not know whether it was fear or relief, so I let it be both. News travels fast in families that used to be close. Within a week, my phone started buzzing again with numbers I had stopped saving. My mother called first, her voice cautious, like someone trying to step onto thin ice. She said she had heard whispers about new developments and wanted to understand what was happening. I told her only that there was proof of falsehoods and that my lawyer was handling it. She went quiet for a long time before saying that she wished she had believed me from the start. I did not know how to answer that, so I said maybe someday we can talk properly again. After we hung up, I sat by the window and watched rain start to fall in narrow silver lines, and I thought about how forgiveness might be less about words and more about letting weather pass through without building walls against it. The man who had sent the evidence kept in touch, but sparingly. He said his conscience felt lighter now that the truth was moving, but he also sounded nervous. Apparently my ex had discovered that some of her files were missing, and she had confronted him before he ended things for good. He worried she might retaliate, though he doubted she could undo what was already in motion. I thanked him again and told him that whatever happened next, I would make sure his help was acknowledged if the court required testimony. He said he would do the right thing no matter how uncomfortable it became. In the meantime, I started writing down everything I remembered from the marriage, not just the painful parts, but the ordinary days that had once felt safe, because memory itself was now evidence of who I truly was. I filled notebooks with scenes of breakfasts and car rides and bedtime stories, trying to capture the rhythm of being a father before it became a legal term. It helped me remember that beneath all the paperwork there had once been a man who simply loved his kids and wanted to build a quiet, stable life. When the preliminary hearing date was announced, my lawyer called to tell me it would be in 2 weeks. That left just enough time for every possible fear to take turns pacing through my mind. I spent those nights half asleep rehearsing what it might feel like to sit in that courtroom again to face the same faces who had watched me fall. I pictured my ex on the stand this time not as the heroine of her own story but as someone caught in her own web of invention. I wondered whether she would still look calm or if guilt would finally show itself on her skin. On the morning of the hearing, I woke before dawn and stood in front of the mirror watching my reflection breathe. The man who looked back at me was older, thinner, lined by exhaustion, but there was a steadiness in his eyes that I had not seen in years. I tied my tie slowly and whispered a small promise to no one in particular that whatever happened that day I would walk out with my dignity intact. Then I stepped into the cold morning air and headed toward the courthouse where the truth was waiting to be heard again. The courthouse had not changed since the last time I stood beneath its stone archway, though it felt smaller now, as if the building itself remembered what it had witnessed and wanted to shrink from the weight of it. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of paper dust and coffee, the kind of scent that settles into every corner of bureaucracy and stays there forever. I took my seat beside my lawyer while he arranged the folders in neat stacks that looked like small fortresses. Across the aisle, my ex sat with her attorney, whispering in low tones. She looked composed, almost practiced in the art of calm, but her hands betrayed her because she kept twisting a ring she no longer wore on that finger. I watched her only long enough to remind myself that anger had no place here. What I needed now was precision. The judge opened the session by summarizing the purpose of the hearing. My lawyer then presented the new evidence one document at a time, explaining how each piece connected to the testimony that had cost me my children. The courtroom was quiet except for the shuffle of pages and the deliberate rhythm of his voice. When he played the audio clip of my ex and my sister talking in that coffee shop, the silence grew thicker. The sound filled the room so clearly that every scrape of ceramic and every casual betrayal echoed against the paneled walls. My ex's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. She stared at the table in front of her as if the grain of the wood could swallow her whole. Then came the moment I had not anticipated. The man who had sent me the files entered as a witness. He looked nervous but resolute. The clerk swore him in, and he began to describe how he had met my ex and how over time he discovered the pattern of manipulation that underpinned her stories. He spoke plainly without embellishment, and that simplicity made his words land harder. He told the court that she had bragged about turning my family against me and had stored falsified screenshots on a cloud drive he later accessed after she left her laptop unattended. He said that after learning the truth, he could not keep silent, knowing what it had cost me. Listening to him speak felt surreal. Here was a stranger with no reason to protect me standing up for what was right, while people who had known me all my life had remained silent. When he finished, the judge asked a few measured questions about authenticity and chain of custody, and then dismissed him with a nod that carried more weight than applause. My ex's attorney requested a recess. The judge granted 10 minutes. She left the courtroom quickly, and my ex followed close behind. I stayed seated, feeling the faint vibration of adrenaline under my skin like distant thunder. When the session resumed, her side looked different. Her lawyer's tone had softened from confident to cautious. He admitted that given the new evidence, his client was willing to cooperate with a full review of the previous testimony. The judge paused for a long moment before agreeing to reopen the case entirely and order an investigation. The gavel struck once, and in that instant I felt a subtle shift inside me, not victory exactly, but something that resembled air returning to lungs that had forgotten how to expand. Outside the courthouse, I stood on the steps while traffic hummed below like an indifferent river. My lawyer joined me and said this was just the beginning, but that it was a strong beginning. He explained that if the investigation confirmed fabrication, the custody ruling could be overturned and the alimony reevaluated. He warned it could take months, maybe longer, but his voice carried a quiet optimism that I had not heard from anyone in a long time. I thanked him and watched him disappear into the crowd, while I stayed still, letting the wind brush across my face. For the first time in years, I felt something resembling equilibrium. Word spread faster than I expected. My mother called again, this time her voice cracked open with apology. She said she had listened to the recording that had been played in court and could not stop crying. She confessed that when my ex first came to her months ago, she had seemed so convincing that she never thought to question the story. I told her that I understood, because lies are easiest to believe when they flatter our instincts to protect. She asked if I could ever forgive her, and I said that forgiveness was not a switch but a door I was learning to keep unlocked. Over the following weeks, my lawyer received more documents from the investigator, each one tightening the chain around the truth. It turned out several of my ex's earlier witnesses had already started to retract their statements once confronted with contradictions. Even my sister reached out timidly, saying she felt sick about everything and that she had been manipulated with half-truths about me. I listened quietly and told her that I hoped she could forgive herself too, because carrying guilt is just another kind of punishment and we had both had enough of those. When the judge finally set the date for the official review hearing, it felt like standing at the edge of something vast and unfamiliar. I knew that whatever the outcome, this process had already changed me in ways I could not yet measure. I had learned that truth can drown for a while, but it does not die. It only waits for someone stubborn enough to dive after it. I spent the nights leading up to the next hearing in a steady calm, organizing papers, not because I needed to, but because order is a language I finally understood again. On the morning of the review, I stood outside the courthouse watching sunlight spill across the steps. My lawyer arrived carrying a briefcase and that same cautious optimism. He told me this could very well be the turning point. As we walked through the doors, I could hear the faint echo of my own footsteps and realized they sounded different now, less like fear and more like forward motion. The judge took her seat and the proceedings began anew, and as my ex approached the stand, she no longer looked composed. She looked like someone standing beneath the truth as it finally began to fall. When she took the stand, the air in the courtroom shifted into that fragile stillness that happens right before a storm begins, and even the sound of paper turning seemed too loud. My ex sat with her shoulders squared, yet her face carried the taut expression of someone aware that the walls were closing in. The judge spoke, first asking if she understood that she was now testifying under renewed oath. She nodded, but her voice, when she answered, cracked just slightly enough for everyone to hear the strain beneath the practiced calm. My lawyer started his questioning gently, at first walking her through her previous statements one by one, then laying each new piece of evidence beside them like a mirror. With every contradiction, her responses became shorter. She blamed confusion, claimed miscommunication, and eventually fell back on the explanation that she had been under emotional stress at the time. He let her talk because silence would have looked worse for her, but every sentence only wrapped her tighter in the web she had spun. The judge watched intently without interruption, her expression unreadable. Then the prosecutor for the state spoke, since the false accusations involved sworn testimony. His questions cut deeper. He asked her if she had coached any witnesses. She hesitated long enough for the pause itself to serve as an answer before finally admitting that she had encouraged certain relatives to describe me in a way that would help her case. When asked why, she said she had been desperate to keep the children because she believed the court would never favor her otherwise. The room went utterly still. Even her lawyer lowered his eyes to the table. I sat there feeling the years of strain lift grain by grain. The relief was not joy exactly, but something quieter and sturdier, like the slow untying of a knot that has lived too long in the muscles. It did not erase what had happened, but it opened space inside me for air, and maybe for a future that did not revolve around defending myself. The judge ordered a brief recess, then returned to announce that the previous verdict was being suspended pending full review, and that I would have temporary visitation reinstated immediately. The gavel fell, and the sound of it echoed through the room with a clarity I will remember for the rest of my life. Outside the courthouse, my lawyer and I stood in the pale afternoon light, and he told me this outcome was rare but not impossible when truth has persistence on its side. He explained the next steps: legal adjustments, re-examinations, and further hearings, but I barely heard him. All I could think about was seeing my children again, without the sterile supervision of glass partitions and guards with clipboards. The idea alone was enough to make my hands tremble. I thanked him for his work and promised I would stay patient through the rest of the process, because patience had become my only real expertise. That evening I walked the long route home through streets lined with autumn leaves that clung to the curbs like confetti from an invisible parade. I could feel exhaustion in every part of my body, yet there was also an unfamiliar lightness. When I reached my apartment, I sat on the floor among the stacks of legal folders that had once represented everything I had lost. For the first time, they looked smaller, less menacing, like relics of a story finally moving toward its conclusion. A few days later, the court approved my first unsupervised visitation. The moment I saw my children again, it felt as if time itself exhaled. They were taller now, older in subtle ways, but their laughter sounded the same. I took them to the park near my apartment where we used to go on weekends before everything had fallen apart. They told me about school and their favorite shows and asked if we could get ice cream on the way home. I agreed, of course, because saying yes felt like reclaiming a word I had been denied for years. When I returned them that evening, my ex waited by the door. She looked smaller than I remembered, not physically but in presence, as if the weight of what she had done had finally started pressing inward. She said little, only that she was sorry and that she had never expected things to go this far. I nodded without speaking, because forgiveness is not a performance, it is a quiet decision that needs time to grow roots. She asked if I would consider keeping the children's schedules flexible while the investigation continued, and I told her we would follow whatever the court decided. Then I turned and walked back to my car, feeling something close to peace for the first time in years. The following weeks passed in a rhythm that almost felt normal. I went to work, came home, cooked simple meals, and began clearing space in the apartment for the kids to spend more nights. My family started visiting again in small, careful steps. My mother brought a box of old photographs she said she had kept in a drawer all this time, waiting for the right moment to return them. Looking at those pictures together felt like opening a window after a long winter, letting in light that smelled faintly of new beginnings. Still, every so often doubt would creep in, whispering that good things rarely last. I would counter it by remembering the sound of the gavel that day, the certainty in the judge's voice, the sight of my children running toward me in the park. These were truths, solid and unembellished. One evening, as I tucked those photographs back into their box, I found one I had never seen before, a picture of me holding both kids at a fair the year before the divorce. My sister must have taken it. I looked at my own expression in that photo and realized that the man in it had not been erased after all, just buried beneath years of defense. Now he was starting to return, one small breath at a time. A week later, my lawyer called again. The investigation was complete, he said, and the results would be delivered to the court soon. He paused, then added that there was one more development that would likely change everything once more. My ex's attorney had contacted him directly to discuss a settlement that would involve full admission of wrongdoing in exchange for reduced penalties. He told me to prepare, because the final hearing would not just close a case, it would close a chapter. I thanked him and hung up the phone, then sat in the quiet apartment, feeling the pulse of something vast about to shift again, just like it always does right before the truth finishes its long walk home. The day of the final hearing arrived beneath a pale sky that looked undecided between sun and rain, and I took it as a good omen, because my life had lived too long between those two weathers, and maybe balance was the right forecast for the end of all this. The courthouse lobby was quieter than usual, though every sound still carried too far in the marble air. My lawyer met me at the entrance, holding a thin folder instead of the thick binders that had once followed him everywhere. He said most of what needed to be said was already written now, we only had to let it breathe in front of the judge. Inside the courtroom, my ex looked different from every other time I had seen her there. The practiced calm was gone, replaced by the expression of someone who had run out of scripts. Her attorney confirmed what we had heard before, that she intended to settle by acknowledging her false testimony and accepting legal responsibility for defamation and obstruction. The judge asked her to confirm this directly. She spoke quietly, eyes lowered, and said that she had lied out of fear and pride, and that she knew she had destroyed more than she could ever rebuild. Her voice wavered when she said she regretted using our children as weapons. I listened to her words without anger, because anger had already burned itself out and left only a kind of clean emptiness where new things might grow. The judge's ruling came after a long silence. The previous custody order was nullified. Full custody reverted to me, with shared visitation determined by evaluation once my ex completed counseling. The alimony obligations were vacated and financial damages were ordered in my favor, though my lawyer would later remind me that collecting them might take time. When the gavel struck for the last time, it did not sound sharp or dramatic, but steady, like a final heartbeat marking the end of one life and the start of another. Afterward, I walked out into the light that filtered through the courthouse doors, and the air tasted sharper than I remembered. My lawyer shook my hand and said it was over, at least on paper, but that healing would have its own schedule. I thanked him for never letting the case fade into background noise, and he smiled, saying that truth is stubborn, and I had been stubborn enough to match it. We parted there at the steps where everything had begun years earlier, and I stood still, letting people pass around me until the crowd thinned and the sound of the street took over. Later that afternoon, I went to pick up my children from school for the first time as their full guardian again. When they saw me waiting by the gate, their faces lit with a kind of unguarded joy that reminded me what all of this had been for. On the walk home, they talked endlessly about small things, homework, art projects, weekend plans. I listened more than I spoke because listening felt like luxury now that the noise of accusation was gone. At home, they rushed to the small bedroom I had set up for them and began arguing about who got which side of the bunk bed, and their laughter filled every corner of the apartment until it sounded like a house again. That evening, as they slept, I sat by the window watching the city's lights flicker like cautious stars. I thought about my ex and wondered what her silence would sound like now that the performance was over. I hoped she would find a way to live honestly because I no longer wished her pain, only distance. I also thought about my family, how they had begun to reappear in my life bit by bit like old photographs developing slowly. My mother had started sending me messages every morning, small check-ins that asked how I slept or what I planned to cook for dinner. My sister had visited last weekend bringing a box of toys she said the kids had left at her place years ago. None of us used the word forgiveness yet, but it hung quietly between us like furniture we all knew was there. Over the next few weeks, the rhythm of life returned with new shapes. The mornings began with cereal spills and missing socks instead of court deadlines. My job, which had been kind enough to keep me on part-time during the chaos, now felt like a place again rather than a hiding spot. I began jogging after sunset just to remember what motion without purpose felt like. Some evenings I would pause by the park where the kids played and watch them chase each other under the lamplight, and I would think about how long it had taken to arrive at something so simple. Occasionally, I still woke in the middle of the night out of habit, expecting the anxiety to clamp down again, but it no longer came. In those quiet hours, I would make tea and stand by the window thinking about the strange symmetry of everything. A lie had taken years to build and only minutes of honesty to unravel. Yet those minutes had needed the weight of every sleepless night, every desperate prayer, every stubborn refusal to give up. I understood then that truth is not swift or merciful but patient and exacting. A few days after the ruling, I received a letter from my ex delivered through her attorney. It was short and handwritten. She said she did not expect me to forgive her, but that she wanted our children to grow up knowing their mother had at least tried to make things right. She promised to complete whatever counseling the court required and to follow every schedule without dispute. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer, not out of resentment but because some apologies need time to mature before they can be read again without bitterness. The last step remaining was to file for restitution of the financial losses I had carried through the years of alimony and legal fees. My lawyer insisted it was my right, but I hesitated because vengeance and justice can look too similar if you stare at them from the wrong angle. Still, I knew that fairness mattered not just for me but for anyone who might face a story like mine one day. So I signed the papers and felt no triumph, only closure. That night after the kids fell asleep, I walked onto the balcony and looked up at a sky finally clear of clouds. The wind moved softly, and somewhere below a dog barked, and the city hummed the ordinary tune of people getting on with their lives. For the first time in years, that tune included me. I realized then that peace is not the absence of pain but the presence of enough truth to stand on without fear of it breaking. And though tomorrow would bring errands and work and lunches to pack, it would also bring something else, something small but steady that felt a lot like freedom. The weeks that followed felt like watching the tide pull back after a long storm, leaving behind a quiet shore full of debris and unexpected shells, and I found myself walking through that landscape, trying to decide what to keep and what to let the water take. Life did not rush to fill the silence. It unfolded in small patient motions, the sound of a pencil being sharpened at the kitchen table, the smell of pancakes on Saturday mornings, the steady rhythm of my children's footsteps as they ran down the hall toward something as simple as the day ahead. The noise of courtrooms and accusations had finally dissolved into memory, though sometimes I could still hear faint echoes of it in my sleep, like the last notes of a song fading into distance. I began rebuilding the house piece by piece, not in the way of paint or furniture, but in the quieter sense of how a space feels when laughter becomes regular again. I cleared out the stacks of papers that had once towered across the living room floor and replaced them with books and drawings and the small clutter of normal life. Each night, when the kids fell asleep, I would stand in their doorway for a moment and remind myself that everything I had endured had led to this ordinary peace. The simplicity of it felt almost sacred. My family returned more fully over time. My mother came for dinner one Sunday and spent half the meal apologizing between compliments about the food. I told her that forgiveness was already happening each time she showed up because consistency is its own language of regret. My sister visited the next weekend and stayed late talking about childhood things until we realized it was nearly midnight. I could see the guilt still shadowing her, but I knew that time would do its work if we let it. I did not need grand gestures. I only needed honesty, which finally seemed to have found a home among us again. As for my ex, she kept her word. She attended counseling and sent carefully worded updates about the children's school events and doctor appointments. Her tone was respectful without pretending at closeness. I understood it as a truce, and I was grateful for that. Every so often when we crossed paths during drop-offs, she looked like someone still searching for a place to set down her remorse. I wished her well silently because wishing ill on her would only keep me tethered to a version of myself I had worked too hard to outgrow. Financial restitution came through months later in a sum that looked large on paper but felt strangely weightless once it arrived. I used part of it to start a college savings account for the kids and another part to pay off the last of my debts. The rest I tucked away for no particular reason other than to have something that belonged to calmness. My lawyer called to congratulate me and said that my case had quietly circulated among his colleagues as an example of perseverance. I laughed softly because perseverance is only glamorous when it belongs to someone else. Living it is just stubborn breathing. Spring arrived before I noticed the calendar had turned. The city thawed and the park near our apartment filled with life again. On weekends we packed sandwiches and spent hours outside watching clouds drift like lazy ships. The kids invented games that made no sense but required constant laughter, and I joined in because joining in was the point. One afternoon as the sun dipped low, my son asked if I was happy now, and I told him I was learning to be. He nodded with the simple wisdom of children who understand that learning is a lifelong thing. At night, after they fell asleep, I often found myself writing. Not about the past, but about the small present moments that once would have gone unnoticed. I wrote about the way light spilled across the kitchen counter in the morning, about the creak of the hallway floorboard that signaled the start of another day, about how peace does not announce itself, it simply sits down quietly and waits for you to notice. Writing became a way to remind myself that the story did not end in a courtroom, it ended here in these small scenes of recovery. Sometimes I still thought about the man who had sent that first email and set everything in motion. I never heard from him again after the final hearing. I hoped he had found his own kind of peace because his courage had changed the trajectory of so many lives, including mine. I kept a printed copy of that first message tucked inside a folder labeled Beginnings because that was what it had turned out to be, not an end at all but a start. Now when I look back on those years, they feel distant, like a landscape seen from the window of a train speeding away. The pain is still visible but blurred, softened by motion. I know there will always be scars, moments when doubt flickers or when anger tries to rise again, but I also know I have learned how to breathe through them. The truth did not make me whole overnight, but it gave me ground to stand on, and from that ground I built something steadier than happiness. On quiet evenings I step onto the balcony after the kids are asleep and watch the city settle into its rhythm of distant sirens and laughter and the faint hum of traffic. I think about how every story eventually reaches a point where revenge becomes irrelevant and understanding becomes enough. I think about how it feels to be trusted again, how it feels to trust myself. And in those moments I realize that the life I have now is not the one I fought to get back, it is something better, a life rebuilt not on what was lost but on what was learned.